Welcome to What's Luxurious About LVT. This is the third and last event of our series, The Fall of Plastic. My name is Leila. I'm a senior researcher in design at Parsons Healthy Materials Lab.
And I'm John Sara, co-founder and design director of Healthy Materials Lab here at Parsons School of Design. So just a little bit of background about us. To all of you, thank you for joining us. Healthy Materials Lab is a design-led research lab at Parsons School of Design, which is housed at the New School University in New York City. So here is where we place people's health at the center of all design decisions. In practice, that means we're dedicated to raising awareness about toxics in our built environment, and we work collaboratively with each other and with partners to make healthier material alternatives more accessible. We do all our work with the explicit focus on those designing, building, and living in affordable housing, because all people deserve healthier environments. We research the material health of building products. We're interested in the ingredients and the full life cycle of materials and their impact on human health and environmental health throughout that cycle. And we want to understand the impact, specifically, especially now, of a product's carbon footprint, as well as any harmful content.
So plastics are increasingly understood as a huge problem, both for its potentially unhealthy contents and for its enormous contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Season 2 of our podcast Trace Material is dedicated to stories of the plastic age. It traces the ways that plastic has reshaped our cultures, our bodies, and our environments throughout this last century. Throughout the podcast, we're trying to understand how we got here. And so in this series, The Fall of Plastics, we examine plastics in building products further. We're looking forward. Where do we go from here? What is a better answer? And what materials might define the next era?
So our questioning quickly focuses on how LVT, or luxury vinyl tile, has become one of the most prevalent materials used in interiors in the United States and maybe around the world. The question is, like, when did the word luxury get tied to polyvinyl chloride? That was someone's brilliant marketing idea. In a brief search of the word luxurious or luxury, it's defined as extremely comfortable, elegant, or enjoyable, especially in a way that involves great expense, which is another clue here. Historically, luxury was tied to opulence, indulgence, and wealth. It was attainable only by a few, people with affluence, who could afford an exclusive lifestyle. It was kind of a gateway in. But after World War II, as industrial processes grew and mass production became the norm, luxury items became democratized and within reach for more and more people. The word luxury, now married to a plastic flooring material, makes people feel that they are purchasing something of the finest elegance, the most comfortable flooring on the market, and that this material will elevate the atmosphere of any interior at an incredibly affordable price. The marketing gimmick was brilliant. But we're here today to ask, what are the real costs of luxury vinyl tile?
So luxury vinyl tile, LVT, is a global trend. It's kind of made it to wonderkind of flooring status, kind of like Mozart to classical music. It mimics the look of stone and wood, but without the complex installation and maintenance needs. It appears inexpensive at procurement, it's waterproof, and it's durable. And beyond that, manufacturers have been making convincing sustainability claims, arguing that their LVT avoids harmful chemicals and achieves a lower carbon footprint. And so this gives us pause. Given that LVT is a synthetic polymer, aka a petrochemical product, with its individual components being shipped back and forth across the globe, and we'll hear more about that later from one of our guests, one wonders how healthy and sustainable can it actually be? And I repeat, what is the actual cost of this product? And our presenters will provide all kinds of insights on that. In our collaborations with architects and designers, LVT often is the flooring of choice, as it meets the criteria of flooring in affordable housing. And we have heard that LVT is used in 50 to 80% of building products these days. 80%.
Yet we know that the ingredients used to make LVT require extraction processes which produce waste that can be terribly harmful to people living near these sites. And likewise, the waste produced during the manufacture of LVT can be equally harmful to people living near factories. And PVC, the main substance used to make LVT, is one of the plastics that cannot be recycled because of its chlorine content, and we're going to hear all about that. So ultimately, it's incredibly wasteful. When it's time for an interior renovation, the LVT flooring gets tossed out and ends up in a landfill or an incinerator, even worse. And there, the plastics is exposed to weather, to sun, and starts to become brittle, leaching microparticles into our water systems and soils that eventually end up in all of us, because our global ecosystems are integrally connected. So the industry likes to emphasize that LVT products are not harmful during the in-use phase, as certain plasticizers like phthalates have been replaced with better ones.
But even if we consider the end consumer unharmed by these products, which we do not, we see huge problems in the life cycle of all vinyl products, whether they're luxurious or not. At COP26, there was much discussion about reducing reliance on coal to reduce CO2 emissions. Yet Jim, one of our speakers today, just released a report that coal may be taking second place to plastics production in terms of its carbon emissions and pollution. Our experts on the panel today dig deeply into waste streams coming out of the manufacturing sites across the world and how they pose severe health risks to those living nearby and eventually to all of us as water flows and air moves laden with harmful chemicals such as, and here comes a spoiler alert for the presentations, asbestos, mercury, chlorine, and PFAS.
So you see, we have questions. What if we make radical changes now? What are the problems we will confront if we don't make a change? As designers and architects, we're so glad to have scientists and material health experts as our colleagues, and for their graciousness to be here today to help provide context to all of these questions. As the hour unfolds, please note your questions in the Q&A section, because there's a lot to dig into today, and we'd like to keep track of every thought people are having. So with that, we're delighted to introduce our guest speakers today. We'll start with Jimena Diaz-Leiva, is the science director at the Center for Environmental Health, where she works to protect people in the environment from exposure to toxic chemicals. Also from the Center for Environmental Health is a good, solid colleague for many years, Judy Levin, who's the former pollution prevention director and the current senior advisor to the Built Environment Program, where they continue, and I always learn from Judy, they continue to reveal and advocate for protecting citizens from toxic chemicals in our lives.
And then we have Jim Vallette, who currently leads Material Research L3C. We think it's not an overstatement to say that his research over the last 30 years is fundamental to what now we call the field of material health. Last month, Jim's report titled The New Coal, Plastics and Climate Change was released by the advocacy group Beyond Plastics, and it's absolutely worth reading. Not with us today, unfortunately, is Eric Bill. He's the chief economist at Autocase and leads the research in economics advisory teams that provide an economic lens for sustainable and resilient lens, particularly to reveal the true costs of cheap, luxurious products. The more extensive bios can be found in the event page on our website, and we're going to link to that in the chat. And with that, I hand it over to you, Judy.
Thank you so much, Jansara and Leila, for the introduction and for this wonderful opportunity. We're very excited to talk with you all today. So my name is Judy Levin, and as Jansara mentioned, I work with the Center for Environmental Health. And the Center for Environmental Health, or CEH as we call it sometimes, is a private nonprofit organization that works to protect the public from exposure to toxic chemicals. So given our 25-year histories on working on toxics and products, we've long been aware of the concerns regarding PVC, the chemical concerns, and the human health and environmental concerns. PVC, or polyvinyl chloride, is what we're talking about, or many people just refer to it as vinyl. So when CEH began working on the product type of healthier flooring, we discovered, as Jansara and Leila mentioned, that PVC, LVT flooring was a very large portion of the market. And we were very surprised to see what seemed to be a surprisingly low reported carbon footprint from the manufacturers. It definitely seemed lower than we were expected, and we were concerned that the reported carbon emissions were failing to account for key processes in the PVC production process. And we also wanted to better understand the quantity of toxic chemicals used to manufacture PVC. And again, the spoiler alert, asbestos, PFAS chemicals, and mercury. But we couldn't find a report that really quantified this information. So we enlisted the help of two research groups, Autocase and Material Research, to help fill in these important gaps. And thanks to these researchers' very thorough and relentless work, we now have been able to fill in these missing carbon emissions data and the quantity of toxic chemicals. So we really want to thank these two organizations for their tireless research and for their commitment to really drilling down into the very, very nerdy details that they had to go through. We expect to be releasing findings from our analysis in the coming months, but for right now, you are all the very first people to hear some of this information. So we're excited to share this with you. Next slide, please. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to do a very quick overview of PVC and LVT. We're going to talk about what conventional assessments omit in their reporting. We're going to discuss an overview of the findings that our research found related to the carbon footprint of LVT. And then we're going to talk about the toxicity of PVC across its life cycle. And then we're going to focus specifically on the use and health effects associated with those three toxic chemicals I mentioned that are used in the production of PVC or LVT. And then we're going to discuss alternatives to these PVC products. And finally, we're going to conclude with questions and answers. I'm going to now turn the mic over to Jim Villette. And again, thank him so much for his great research. Thank you, Jim.
Great. Thanks a lot, Judy. And thanks also to Parsons Healthy Materials Lab for hosting this really important event. And thanks to everybody attending. Thanks for considering your interest in what we have to say. I hope you can apply some of this to your daily work. I'll start here with a little context about why luxury vinyl tile flooring from China has come to dominate the US market. Please keep this in mind. Luxury vinyl tile flooring is simply polyvinyl chloride or PVC flooring. Luxury vinyl tile, as Jansara and Leila discussed, is just a marketing term for floors that are made from layers upon layers of cheap plastic derived from fossil fuels. Starting 10 years ago, in 2012, flooring companies in the United States announced that they were launching new product lines called luxury vinyl tiles. What they did not announce was that most of this flooring was coming from China. From 2012, imports of PVC vinyl flooring soared from 25 million square feet to 100 million square feet last year, with all of that growth coming from China. Nearly half of all floors sold in the United States right now are made in China. Economics are a big part of this, of course. It's a lot cheaper to produce vinyl floors where the government itself is making them, where there are no repercussions for the harms that are done to workers and to the planet. Much of the PVC made in China comes from regions where environmental oversight and labor protections are the weakest. LVT production is a labor-intensive, environmentally damaging process. A flooring journal said in 2014 that making these floors would be, quote, cost prohibitive in the United States, unquote. A flooring manufacturer in China, the Zhahao Group, says the traditional LVT floor has complex production processes, high energy consumption, long labor time, and is not conducive to environmental protection. A flood of LVT from China has overwhelmed the US flooring workforce. Instead of making their own floors, most US flooring companies have become merely brokers between US consumers and state-controlled firms in China that are making the floors. Since 2012, at least 18 flooring factories have closed in the United States. More than 2,500 workers have lost their jobs. Many of these factories were making products, flooring products other than vinyl, such as wood flooring. The surge in vinyl flooring imports from China coincided with demands by architects and designers and building owners for transparency from the flooring industry. One form of supposed transparency is called an environmental product declaration. These statements are creations of the flooring industry. They include a lot of numbers and a lot of tables. They create an impression that this is a full accounting of a product's lifetime impacts on the environment, including greenhouse gas emissions associated with its production, use, and disposal. Nowadays, to satisfy procurement guidelines, manufacturers routinely publish EPDs for vinyl flooring, including LVT from China. What most of these EPDs fail to mention or factor into their calculations is that most of the floors are made in China and that they're made from coal and mercury. Earlier this year, as Judy noted, the CEH's procurement program recognized this important gap. CEH asked Autocase to look at the numbers behind the EPDs, and my company has been looking at this industry for a long time. Both Autocase and CEH asked us to advise on this project. Autocase's team of data analysts found that most flooring EPDs are deeply flawed. What many firms accept as transparency documents are really quite opaque. Autocase identified real-world examples, average-sized production plants in the United States and China. Autocase identified 26 distinct stages of extraction, production, and delivery of vinyl floors from China, and 23 stages in the US-based supply chain. EPDs published by the industry typically squeeze all of these stages into one number that's impossible to fact check. In Autocase's US-based real-world example, for most of the production and pollution associated with vinyl flooring occurs in a chemical plant based in the Gulf Coast town of Ingleside, Texas. This is the US-based case study. It's of average size. Occidental Chemical in Ingleside uses technologies that are typical for US polyvinyl chloride production. It receives raw materials from around the world. The company owns hydrofracturing sites in the Permian Basin in West Texas, and it pipes natural gas liquids from there to Ingleside to make ethylene, which is the most important feedstock for making plastics in the United States. Another key ingredient of vinyl plastics is chlorine, which comes from brine. In Occidental's case, this brine is extracted pretty close to the chemical plant. It also imports the mineral asbestos to separate chlorine from the brine. The asbestos arrives by ship from mines in Brazil and in the Ural Mountains of Russia. The Texas factory features a huge piece of equipment called an ethane cracker. This produces the ethylene that is reacted with chlorine to produce vinyl chloride monomer, which Occidental then exports to Mexico and Colombia. There, the vinyl chloride monomer is turned into the plastic resin polyvinyl chloride. This resin is then shipped back to the United States, where a handful of plants still produce vinyl floors. Toxic waste from the Ingleside plant are burned in incinerators and buried in landfills in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. The plant in China, identified by Autocase, like the one in Texas, is quite average for the country's industry. But typical production in China is very different than Texas. The real-world example used by Autocase is a chemical and flooring factory in the city of Yibin on the Yangtze River in south-central China. It consumes vast quantities of coal that are mined right there in Yibin. The coal is used in two ways. One, to power the production of chlorine from brine, and two, to form vinyl chloride monomer in reaction with the chlorine. Yibin uses PFAS chemicals to separate the chlorine from the brine. The PFAS is produced in a fluorochemical complex in eastern China. Yibin also consumes and releases tons of mercury that are obtained from small artisanal mines in a nearby province. Yibin uses the mercury to react the chlorine with the coal. The Yibin plant is vertically integrated from the mining of coal to the production of vinyl floors, including the vinyl floors, the LVT, shipped to the United States. Since the beginning of this year, 2021, Yibin has sent 364 shipping containers of vinyl flooring, that's more than one shipment each day, to the United States. Just last week, on November 10th, the biggest delivery yet of vinyl flooring from Yibin to the United States occurred. A ship called the Billisborg arrived in Portland, Oregon, with 140 containers filled with floors weighing a total of 4.6 million pounds. Autocase found studies that corresponded with each of these stages in the production and delivery of the floors in their case studies. It concluded that environmental product declarations vastly underestimate the carbon impact of producing and delivering PVC flooring to the United States. Autocase found that this discrepancy is because EPDs use data that's from just one company from around 2004, is quite outdated. And these EPDs apply the same data to floors that were produced in China, where production is very different. Autocase crunched the numbers. They found that the industry's declaration was off by 24% for the Texas-based production and 35% for Yibin, China. While most resilient flooring production now occurs in China, US flooring companies, architects, designers, and building owners who purchase LVT share responsibility for this climate pollution. Last month, Beyond Plastics published this report, on which I was the lead author and researcher, The New Coal, Plastics and Climate Change. The Beyond Plastics report details how the increased use of plastics in the United States is helping to drive carbon dioxide emissions worldwide. In this report, I estimated that the US plastics industry is responsible for 232 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year. That's the equivalent of 116 average-sized coal-fired power plants. I found that more than 7% of these emissions are occurring in China from the production of vinyl flooring for US consumers. Another gap in the EPDs that Autocase explored was the release of toxic substances. To discuss these and other issues, I'll pass the presentation now to Jimena, Science Director of the Center for Environmental Health.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Healthy Materials Lab for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today about this important topic. So I want to talk about toxics in flooring production and vinyl flooring production today. And although luxury vinyl tile is billed as a healthier and cheaper alternative, the production of this flooring, as Jim has already discussed, emits more carbon dioxide than previously thought. And importantly, it uses and generates toxic chemicals and byproducts. Dangerous substances like asbestos, mercury, and PFAS chemicals are essential inputs in the production of vinyl flooring. While we mainly focus on these three toxics that are used in the initial steps of production, at every phase in the production process, from raw materials to disposal, vinyl flooring both uses and generates toxics that harm the environment and threaten public health. Our demand for luxury vinyl tile in the United States drives environmental harm both locally in places like the Gulf states and abroad in places like China. The impacts of pollution from vinyl flooring production also cross borders, as for example, toxic mercury emissions circulate around the globe. Well, I'm going to start by discussing these three toxic chemicals used to produce vinyl flooring. These are very familiar chemicals to some: asbestos, mercury, and PFAS. I want to start by offering some context on these three chemicals and their human and environmental health impacts. Asbestos, as many of you are aware, is very dangerous when inhaled. Asbestos is a cancer-causing substance, and there are well-documented effects of asbestos inhalation causing lung damage, including scarring in the lungs called asbestosis. Pleural disease is a thickening of the membrane surrounding the lungs and a fluid buildup in the lungs that causes difficulty breathing. And mesothelioma is a cancer that manifests in the membrane surrounding the lungs and chest cavity. And it's a rare cancer linked to asbestos exposure. You probably started to hear a lot about PFAS chemicals. PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, are often called forever chemicals because their characteristic bonds are extremely stable and don't degrade over time. They're a very large class of man-made chemicals with more than 9,000 currently known. They persist in the environment where they accumulate in the bodies of people and wildlife. They can be inhaled, ingested, and taken up by plants and animals. And PFAS are used in a wide variety of products to impart water resistance, grease resistance, and non-stick properties. These PFAS chemicals are highly toxic and linked to a range of adverse health outcomes. Some of the best studied outcomes of PFAS exposure are increased cholesterol levels, kidney cancer, liver damage. These are also considered endocrine disrupting chemicals that have effects at very low doses. And because there are new PFAS developed constantly by the chemical industry, we don't know about the health effects of some of these newer compounds, but we do know that their chemical similarity to older compounds likely means that they share many of these same adverse health effects. Finally, the third chemical in this trio is mercury. Mercury is a very mobile element in the environment, and mercury emissions from vinyl flooring production can enter the atmosphere and be transported over long distances, where they're then redeposited on land and in waterways. In water bodies, mercury can be transformed into its most toxic form, methyl mercury, which readily accumulates and concentrates up the food chain. Large-bodied and predatory fish, like the one in this picture, accumulate high concentrations of mercury. And when humans consume these fish, they become exposed to this neurotoxic chemical. Mercury is well known for its effects on the nervous system, the brain, the kidneys, and the cardiovascular system. And mercury exposure is particularly dangerous for pregnant women and children, as methyl mercury can pass through the placenta and blood-brain barrier, affecting the neurological development of children. Finally, because mercury is very persistent in the environment, it's difficult to clean up and can be released or remobilized from sediments and soils into the environment. So while we did not directly measure the harm caused by exposure to toxics used in vinyl flooring production, we do know that those that are most harmed are those workers and individuals living near manufacturing and waste facilities. And we know that these communities that are most affected by this pollution are also those that already face multiple threats from things like climate change, from lack of access to adequate healthcare, and from co-exposures to other hazardous facilities. The demand for vinyl flooring in the United States is outsourcing this harm to places like China, and within the US to places like this. This is St. Gabriel, Louisiana, located in what's called Cancer Alley, an 85-mile area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, home to more than 165 petrochemical plants. The rate of cancer for residents living in these areas is tens of times higher than that of an average American. And these are poor, predominantly Black communities bearing the burden of pollution caused by demand for vinyl flooring. So now I want to tell you a little bit about Autocase's findings around the toxic chemicals used in PVC production. As Jim mentioned, Autocase and Material Research followed the life cycle of vinyl produced by two companies with two distinct production processes that are representative of the vinyl flooring industry as a whole. Both companies supply the US market, and the technologies they use are representative of what's commonly used in that country. Within these distinct production processes, I want to describe how mercury, PFAS, and asbestos are used. And it might sound surprising to hear that asbestos is still used in manufacturing, but in fact, this is the last legal use of asbestos in the United States. So the US site we studied was Occidental Chemical, located in Ingleside, Texas. As Jim mentioned, two critical inputs to producing vinyl are some carbon source and chlorine. In the US, this carbon source is natural gas, and specifically ethane derived from hydrofracking in the Permian Basin of Texas. As many of you likely know, hydrofracking not only generates greenhouse gas emissions from leaks at wellheads and flaring, but it also uses hundreds of toxic chemicals in the process of fracturing shale rock. In addition, Occidental uses asbestos as a filter to separate out chlorine from saltwater brine. So asbestos is used in chlorine production in the United States. Many people, again, believe that asbestos is outlawed because of how dangerous the substance is and the well-documented health effects of asbestos exposure. But asbestos used in chlorine production or chloralkali plants is the last permitted use in the US. And all of the asbestos imported to the US is being used in making this critical component of vinyl flooring. The US imports hundreds of tons of asbestos per year to be used in producing chlorine. This asbestos, as Jim mentioned, is mined in either Brazil or Russia, where there are documented adverse health effects to local populations. These are fibers that, when handled, can get into the air and can be inhaled by workers. And in addition, because there's a long shipping and handling process, there's a potential that bags of asbestos rip open and expose workers who transport these products. In the actual production of vinyl, asbestos is used as a filter to separate saltwater brine into chlorine, and this chlorine is then combined with carbon to make the building blocks of vinyl or vinyl chloride monomers. Over time, these filters are degraded, need to be replaced, and the old filters are thrown away in landfills nearby where the wind can blow around the asbestos fibers. Just this past year, the EPA determined that processing and industrial or commercial use of asbestos filters or diaphragms in the core alkali industry poses an unreasonable risk to workers. So what happens after the chlorine and carbon are formed? They're combined to form an intermediary chemical that's heated up until it splits or cracks into the building blocks of vinyl called vinyl chloride monomers. And then these are the intermediaries that are shipped abroad to Colombia and to Mexico for final production of vinyl flooring. So the toxic vinyl production process doesn't end with the formation of chlorine in these US-based plants. I won't go into detail about this step in the process, but I just wanted to mention that many of the facilities where these intermediaries are formed are located in places like Cancer Alley. And in addition to the toxic asbestos that is used in chlorine production, there are emissions of ozone depleting organochlorine chemicals that result from reacting chlorine and carbon. And there are also emissions of cancer-causing chemicals like ethylene oxide. Again, these are the hidden costs of vinyl production that don't end up reflected in the price of the product, but that are instead borne by communities living near these facilities. So in China, Autocase followed the Yibin Heifeng company or the Yibin plant. At the Yibin plant, mercury and PFAS chemicals are used to produce vinyl. In contrast to the Occidental plant, at this plant, coal is used as a carbon source for producing vinyl, and mercury is used later in the process as a catalyst that aids in the combination of the carbon and chlorine. Now that you have seen how asbestos is used in vinyl production in the US, I want to tell you about this very different process in China that uses PFAS or forever chemicals in place of asbestos. So PFAS chemicals replace the asbestos filters used in the United States. The use of asbestos filters is a relatively old technology that's increasingly being replaced with PFAS that are sprayed onto these membranes to help separate saltwater brine into chlorine. These membranes have to be regenerated over time, requiring more PFAS chemicals, and in spraying these substances, workers can inhale the compounds. Because PFAS used in this process are not regulated, we simply don't have reliable information on the releases in factory air stacks into water or in surrounding communities. There's really a dearth of information on the contamination caused by this process. We also don't know about the disposal of spent membranes and whether they end up in landfills or how they're disposed of. What we know from well-documented case studies of PFAS releases in other places like the Cape Fear River in North Carolina is that PFAS pollution has the potential to devastate local communities. Finally, I want to talk about how mercury is used in vinyl flooring production. So mercury salts are used as a catalyst in the production of PVC in China. In this production process, coal is reacted with chlorine gas using these mercury salts. Mercury readily evaporates in this process, and these mercury vapors can damage workers' lungs, causing chemical pneumonitis and bronchiolitis. In addition, the spent catalyst is considered hazardous waste, and there are reports of workers handling this waste without health precautions. The mercury used in this process is mined in China, and this mining generates pollution for nearby communities with documented health impacts for those working in the mines and living nearby. I also just want to note that the Yibin factory is located at the confluence of two rivers, which form the Yangtze River, an important fishery for local populations. And mercury bioaccumulation in fish in this river poses a health hazard to people who consume the fish. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the Yibin plant uses a different carbon source than the US Occidental plant. In China, there's an abundant supply of cheap coal that's reacted with chlorine to form these vinyl chloride monomers, but it's also used to power the chemical reactors. The vinyl production process is energy intensive and requires a lot of coal. As we know, the combustion of coal generates greenhouse gas emissions and also releases other pollutants like soot, smog, and even more mercury. Most of the vinyl flooring used in the US is being produced in China using coal. So we've talked about vinyl flooring's carbon footprint and the toxic chemicals used and released in the production of this flooring. As I wrap up this presentation, I wanted to touch on yet another toxic threat at the end of life of vinyl flooring. Claims of recyclability of vinyl flooring haven't borne out, and we're left with a lot of waste, much of which ends up in landfills or incinerators. When vinyl is burned, either in an incinerator or in an accidental fire, it releases toxic dioxins and furans. In places like California that are prone to wildfires, these chemicals pose a serious threat to the health of residents and first responders. When thinking about cost, we hope you consider the true costs of vinyl. While luxury vinyl tile may be cheap to users, it's costly and decidedly unluxurious to workers, surrounding communities, and to our health. Those that bear the burden of environmental pollution and occupational exposure due to the demand for vinyl flooring are communities that already face many environmental threats and have been historically marginalized. So what are the alternatives? We know from a toxic standpoint that better alternatives exist. CEH has partnered with Healthcare Without Harm to support purchasers, designers, and architects to select healthier, resilient flooring products that are free of vinyl and a range of other toxic chemicals. We believe that you all listening to this presentation have the power to move the market towards safer alternatives by choosing healthier vinyl-free products. We also encourage you to demand that manufacturers be more transparent about their supply chains so that you can make informed decisions about what you purchase. Finally, we hope that you'll help spread the word to your colleagues and clients that vinyl tile is anything but luxurious.
Thank you so much, Jimena and Jim, for your presentations. I am definitely inspired by you both and want to thank you. This is a screenshot of our Resilient Flooring and Carpeting shopping guide. It was done in coordination with our partner, Healthcare Without Harm, as Jimena mentioned, who have been great partners. It is not at all specific just to healthcare institutions. It's appropriate for all organizations. And the products that are listed in this shopping guide are being used at organizations, in government, higher education, schools, etc. I do want to mention that Healthcare Without Harm has been rolling out a new seal called Green Health Approved. And so products are just beginning to get registered to that. And so if you look at our shopping guide, you'll see that some of them have received the Green Health Approved seal, and others have not yet approved that seal, have not received the seal yet, have not gone through that process. So we just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please. So as Jimena said, here's the good news, and there is good news, because unfortunately we can't allow our government, we can't count on our government to protect us from exposure to toxic chemicals the way that we would need to be protected. But you have a very, very important role, a very important voice, and that is your purchasing dollars, your specifying dollars. So when we have seen that designers and purchasers all send a very harmonized message to manufacturers about what they're looking for, that they're looking for healthier products without PVC and other toxic chemicals, the market responds, because that's how market forces work, right? We want, businesses want customers, and if there are no customers for their toxic products, they will innovate and create safer products. So when you specify healthier products for your organization or your client, you are actually transforming the whole industry for everyone, because companies are not going to make one type of product for just these organizations and different ones for others. And as Jimena said, right now there are safer non-PVC flooring options that are being used in all these settings, including affordable housing, as John, Sarah, and Layla have referred to, healthcare, schools and universities, government buildings, and even private corporations. So we encourage you to join with CEH's purchasing partners like Kaiser Permanente, the states of New York, the state of Minnesota, the city and county of San Francisco, Harvard University, the University of California's 10 campus system, private businesses like Genentech and LinkedIn, and many, many more, I could go on, who have already adopted and have taken on the specifications for either healthier furniture that does not contain PVC and or healthier flooring. We've seen this market demand strategy work repeatedly, and it doesn't take time-consuming legislation or regulations, which are very difficult to achieve. So each of you is an essential and powerful part of the solution. So I hope that you will reach out to my colleagues. Next slide. Elena Spar, Sarah Packer, or myself to learn more about how we can help you select healthier PVC-free products that don't contain the toxic chemicals of concern and have lesser carbon footprints. Thank you so much for your attention and for your time. I know we will be going into questions and answers.
Thank you, Judy and Jimena and Jim, for this extraordinarily enlightening presentation and research. And it's really, I'm gonna just pause a minute while the sirens go by. But it's really so amazing that you're actually dug so deeply into this research. You know, when we've started asking this question, you know, what's the deal? Like, why luxury vinyl tile is taking over the industry of design and architecture. It's taking over, and we've got to know if it's okay or not. We've got to know what these impacts are. And you know, of course, we knew it's PVC, and so it's not okay. But what are the impacts? And so your research couldn't be more welcomed, and amazing that you've put this much into it. You know, there are a bunch of questions in the chat, and so even though we have some questions, maybe we'll just jump into our guest questions. There's one that asks simply, like, how did you get this information? What was the process of doing this research, and how did you get the information from Yibin?
I guess I could take this one. So Yibin first came across my radar several years ago when I was researching the global chlor-alkali and PVC industry for the Healthy Building Network. And you can find the results of that research, an extensive inventory of 156 different facilities around the world, including Yibin, at Healthy Building Network's website. That was published in 2019. Been monitoring the flood of vinyl flooring, and Yibin's name has been popping up a lot, especially in the last 2 years in the trade records. And the flood is just increasing, as we saw last week with that massive shipment to Portland, Oregon. The information, so in terms of seeing the connections to the US market, that's how we see that. Knowing about the mercury, you can see the citations in the inventory. For all the production data that went into that, some subsequent research for this project, we were able to see where they were getting the PFAS from the fluorochemical industry in China, the mines to the west where they're getting the mercury. You could see from broadcasts in China the mining and all the accidents that occur with that mining of coal in Yibin. And just looking, you know, satellite maps, you can see what's going on over time as well. So a lot of different techniques. It's kind of looking inside the kitchen as we cook these things up, but yeah, we can figure out anything given enough time.
It's amazing. Your research is always astonishing, incredibly deep, and so important. So of course, the questions that are coming up many times over are, what are the healthy alternatives? And so, and Judy, thank you for that research. There's a question about whether Robin Gunther, also a great colleague, asks, has CEH evaluated bio-based plank? And there's another question about thoughts on marmoleum, linoleum. So maybe we could lump those two together.
I think if I can, I will refer this comment to Jim, who has been doing most of that research, and also perhaps the Sarah Packer who may want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, the bio-based products, the tile and plank that are made in Mississippi do show some promise, I think, from what we've seen. There's been increased transparency over the years for those products. The environmental product declarations are opaque like all the others. It's really hard to, a lot of what goes into those environmental product declarations in terms of the calculations of greenhouse gas. The flooring companies like to load on a lot of impacts on maintenance, and there's very little information on production. What Eric and Autocase did was look at vinyl and all these other, and try to look at the EPDs for these other floors, including bio-based, from the really important stages of extraction to the delivery of these floors to consumers. What Eric found is just from those EPDs, many times over more CO2 emissions from the vinyl than from the BBT. And in terms of the toxic inputs, I don't know what kind of pesticides are being used in those life cycles yet, but in terms of what's been declared, I haven't seen a lot to be too concerned about there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. And I did want to mention that we do have some bio-based tile on our shopping guide. You'll notice that.
Perfect.
I can just add to that. We, I think that question also mentioned marmoleum, which is a linoleum product. And we do also have that listed on our list of products that meet our safer materials criteria. So both the bio-based, there are both bio-based and linoleum-based products on that list. And as Judy mentioned, Green Health Approved, we consider to be that to be the strongest standard out there for carpet and flooring. And so if there are products on that list, that means they've been vetted and determined to not contain a pretty long list of toxic chemicals. So while there, as Jim mentioned, there are still some things that we need to learn more about them, we feel pretty good about their health profile.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah,
there's one question from Paul Along, and he's wondering whether you can indicate whether all vinyl products are not sustainable, or whether there is any that is sustainable, particularly if they say they're free from phthalates, lead, cadmium, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the short answer is no, because fossil fuels are not sustainable. But I will let Jim and Jimena address the other issues regarding like phthalates, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that some of the floors coming in from China are bypassing any kind of screens, for example, for phthalates, or even lead stabilizers. That's traditionally been used in vinyl flooring for decades. Recently, the industry shifted away from lead to less toxic stabilizers. But in China, phthalates, orthophthalates, and lead stabilizers are still the most common functional chemicals used in vinyl production. There are floors that are going directly from these factories to affordable housing, to hotels, without any kind of certification, any kind of vetting process, and there are no regulations to prevent that. There's nobody at customs checking for lead or phthalates in these containers. So we don't know what's in these floors. The certifications often are run by the industry itself. I think if anyone still, after hearing this presentation, is going to specify vinyl, you need to ask the producers, where did that resin come from? That's a question that's never asked. And where did that PVC resin come from? And from there, you'll get a lot more understanding of what's inside of these floors.
Yeah, I think that the claim that some PVC is phthalate free and therefore is better, is a little bit misleading, and it takes us away from the very concept that because of the very intensive chemical production process to make PVC and the carbon footprint, that it is not sustainable right from the beginning, whether it has phthalates or not. And as Jim said, we don't know always whether a product does or does not contain these chemicals of concern.
And just thanks, Judy. Absolutely. And another toxic substance to be concerned about in use is vinyl chloride monomer. There's no safe level of vinyl chloride monomer, but there are residuals of vinyl chloride monomer in PVC resins. I've seen test results of resins coming from Colombia, for example, that originate with that vinyl chloride monomer made in Texas, that are in excess of industry standards, and those standards again are set at levels above any kind of consideration of safety. So that's another chemical that's in floors to be concerned about in use, and has very little transparency other than these industry run certifications.
And going back to that concept of moving the market, I mean, that's really, again, where all of you come in place, is we need to ask the companies to innovate and create, safer products that don't rely on toxic chemicals and then don't have this intensive carbon footprint, because that's what we need to really have a safe product.
It's great. There's some really excellent questions in this list, and it's hard to stop, but maybe just a couple of just more statistics, just clarifying, like what is the percentage of Chinese made vinyl flooring in the United States versus that made in the US market? That's just a kind of a ballpark figure, or maybe maybe it's much more accurate.
Yeah, when I looked at trade data recently, it was something like 44% of all floors, including carpet, coming into the US are made in China, almost all from PVC. So it's a huge share. It's growing last week with that massive shipment to Portland. And the industry is shrinking in the United States as these increase. So the proportion's only getting higher every year. You're mute, John. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Just so many great questions. It's hard to end, but I think that we're going to have to end. I think obviously this was an amazing reveal for so many of us, and for a lot of architects and designers who are listening now to this research for the first time. The great thing is that as you said, that the demand for these products comes a lot from these architects and designers and developers of buildings. And you have a bunch here who are now going to convince their clients not to use LVT, which is fantastic. Hopefully we'll begin, as one question said, hopefully North America will begin to ban the use and production of this material as they have in Europe. We're not quite there yet, but yeah, thank you so much. And we will have this recording available to those who attended today. So just keep a lookout in your email. We'll send it to you in the next few days. And again, Judy, Jim, Jimena, Sarah, Milena, thank you so much for all the time and dedication you gave to presenting this really important research here today. We're so grateful for your time and for your colleagueship.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from those of you who want to get some help on how to find healthier furniture and flooring without these chemicals of concern. Thank you again to the Healthy Materials Lab.